Bread. It's the basic stuff of life. The first grinding stone was invented in Egypt over 10,000 years ago, and ever since, bread has been an important staple food for human beings. But bread has come to represent more than just food. It symbolizes well-being and prosperity. Think of all the times that bread plays a central role in the scriptures, beginning with the Israelites in the wilderness. God provided manna from heaven. In the New Testament, Jesus is tempted by Satan to turn stones into bread. Jesus broke bread at the Last Supper, instituting the Eucharist. In the middle of the Gospel of Matthew, we have a story about Jesus multiplying bread for the crowds. Wait, not just one story, but two. That's what we'll explore today on The Way. Welcome back to the second half of The Way, the Gospel of Matthew. We are nearing the midway point of the book, but we're also nearing the end of Act 2, and we're about to embark on the climactic Act 3. But before we get there, today we're going to examine the stories of Jesus feeding the multitudes. Now, in each one of the four Gospels, we have a story like this in which Jesus feeds a large crowd with very little. But in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, this story appears twice. Now, in Matthew, these stories are very, very similar. So in chapter 14, as you've read, Jesus is in front of a crowd of about 5,000 men, plus women and children. And he takes 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and he multiplies them and feeds everybody, and they have 12 baskets of leftovers at the end. And then in the next chapter, the very next chapter, Jesus is in front of a crowd of 4,000 men this time, plus women and children. And this time he has 7 loaves of bread and a few fishes, and he feeds everybody with that, with 7 baskets of leftovers. So why are there 2 stories? Why are there 2 stories of what sounds like the same event? Obviously, Matthew is copying or taking the stories from Mark, which was written first. He's using that as source material. But do these 2 stories refer to 2 completely separate historical events? Or are they 2 different versions of the exact same story? Well, my answer is, of course, going to be, we have no idea. We don't know what actually happened, what happened historically, what a journalist would have written if he or she had been there. But what's important to us is why Matthew records the story twice. What is the point that Matthew's trying to make? Because surely he knew, boy, these stories sound very, very similar. So why did he include both of them? Well, we get a very significant clue about what Matthew's point is in chapter 16. After both of these feedings have occurred, there's a short anecdote in which Jesus says to the disciples, watch out and be on guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the disciples have this little debate among themselves because they realize they'd forgotten to bring some bread with them on this little journey. Apparently, they'd forgot to bring one of the baskets of leftovers with them. And so they're caught without any bread, and they think that's what Jesus is referring to. And Jesus says, no, he says, you people of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you don't have any bread? Don't you understand what has happened? And then he reminds them of the 2 feeding stories that have just happened. He said, didn't I take 5 loaves of bread and feed the 5,000? And didn't I take the 7 loaves of bread and feed the 4,000? Didn't you know that I wasn't talking here about real bread, but I'm talking about the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees? So I believe that the key to understanding what's going on here has to do with the matter of faith. Specifically, the faith or the lack of faith of the disciples. That's why Jesus says, "O ye, you people of little faith." He is admonishing them because even after they have experienced the miracle of Jesus feeding these crowds, even after he's done this in front of them, he's done it not once but twice, they still don't understand that they are to have and put their trust and their faith into Jesus and his teaching rather than to the teaching of anyone else, especially the Pharisees and the Sadducees or the religious establishment. Now, I asked Dr. Wes Allen of Perkins School of Theology the same question: why 2 feeding stories? And here's what he had to say.
Well, part of what I think is happening is he just inherited these from Mark, because Mark has the doublet of the feeding stories. And in Mark, it very much builds into that messianic secret. They didn't get it the first time. They don't even get it after the second time. And I think some of that still is there with Matthew, and I think he basically just inherits it. Those doublet stories often don't add a lot new the second time. It's just like really re-emphasizing it. Jesus, the disciples say, dismiss them. And it sounds like they're just tired of them. That's the way it's often read. We want private time with you. I think they're expressing real concern. This crowd's up here. They need to get somewhere where they can eat. It's nightfall. And Jesus basically says, you take care of them. Again, I think we're talking about the commissioning of the church. Because I think almost always the disciples are representatives of the ecclesia. And so the 2 scenes both show the church has the ability to care for the world, care for the community. I think that's a big part of it. Again, though, I don't want it... since the Enlightenment, we've tried to explain away the miracles, and give a rational. And one of these you hear in sermons all the time. They become stewardship sermons. Worst use of these stories ever. That through the generosity that begins, others start pulling out food they had. No, that's not the way the story is told. The story is clear that this is a miracle. And there's power involved here. So I think, again, in terms of the transfer of authority down the line, that means what Jesus affects, now the church can affect. I do think the other scene in which the disciples don't get it and they think, are we talking about the feeding, is just another way of showing that they don't get it all yet. And for Mark, that has to happen at the cross. I think for Matthew, it's at the resurrection when Jesus returns to the mountain, presumably from the Sermon on the Mount in Galilee, and now they're told to teach what I've taught, basically, to all the nations.
And so now we come to the beginning of Act 3. And everything begins to change as Jesus begins to set his face towards Jerusalem. And it all begins when he asks what sounds like might be an innocent question. Who do people say that I am? We'll get into that next week on The Way. See you then.